Welcome to Conceit. I'm Clayton Hester. This is part of the Arrow Podcast Network. I'm multimedia editor here at Southeast Arrow. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what is the deal with this title, first of all? And maybe it wasn't all given away within the description, and so I'd like to kind of go into that for this inaugural episode of the show. Why is this word here? Does it mean I'm full of myself? Well, I've gotten that accusation before. And, we podcasters love to hear ourselves talk, but no, in reality. I'm talking about the literary meaning of the word. The conceit of a thing is the idea, a trope, or really the premise that's behind it all. What is the thing in a story that makes it different? For instance, the conceit of Lord of the Rings is that they're in another world called Middle Earth. The conceit of Dr. Dolittle is that a man can talk to animals, and, well, the animals have something to say. The conceit could also be more mundane. The conceit of Sherlock Holmes' vast and unwieldy canon is that he's a shrewd and unyielding detective, revealing something about his world's idea of how truth can be revealed. It says something about epistemology. Resources like Etym Online, about etymology and such, date conceit back to the 14th century, in which it basically refers to any sort of notion or thought, but in a couple centuries it had developed to mean a, quote, fanciful or witty notion, ingenious thought. Well, there are a lot of places I could go with this conversation of genre fiction and different areas of thought, and I want to go through those with you here on Conceit. This show really is, at its core, about genre. What are the pieces that make this up? What puts this together? Kind of with that, you can analyze it. Genre is considered a box, but what are the dimensions of that box? What are the measurements? Where does it go? What's the layout? What are the instructions on the box as well? And how can you break those rules? Like, does the box play any part in the actual makeup of what goes on inside the box? What's in the box? Is there a cat in there, like Schrodinger? Anyway, that's kind of off subject, but hey, cats. The box is there for good purposes, and I think that one of the fun things about genre is that if it is a box, and I know that usually that's referred to as kind of belittlement, I think it's there to be played with, and sometimes the best fun you can have is with the box that the thing itself comes in. Not to get too meta there, but yeah, metafiction would be a good example of that, but that in general messes with fiction. Now, I think that we see a lot of interesting things going on in terms of the existence of these genres and the ways that they can be inverted. That subversion in terms of storytelling is something that gets talked about a lot these days. I know it has become a big subject in terms of genre throwbacks. When we take a genre and bring it back, to life, when we reinvigorate it with a new premise or something new about it, or we intentionally subvert it. Those have been done as well. A lot of folks that have created B-movie, such as, imitating stuff from the 50s, black and white, Ed Wood type stuff, just for the purpose of inverting it or kind of maybe even, congealing it into something more solidified, something more put together, something more dense, something more packaged, something more self-aware as well. And self-awareness doesn't always come in forms of, jokes about the absurdity of any sort of situation. Sometimes it's purely about the fact that, we're here and this is the world that we're living in. And we come to accept that. Initially, if you introduce a premise, something so abstract and bizarre, you kind of introduce that through context clues and surrounding evidence. But that, as time goes by, as genre is recognized for the components and pieces that go into it, that itself provides a gateway into better analyzing it and, well, better accepting it on part of those that are watching. And yeah, so that's really the whole idea. I like to think of it as a box theory, if you will, as to how it goes and plays out, and how even then, the box gets messed with with subversion. Rian Johnson, for instance, is one of those filmmakers that does a lot in terms of messing with expectations based on how he lays out a movie, based in good detail on things that we have expected, things that we might be kind of considering normal. And he takes those expectations and does something interesting, takes a detour, takes us down a different route. And that's really an interesting way of looking at the box of genre. And there are a lot of different places I really want to go with this. There really are. The first season of this podcast is going to focus on the subject of religion and science fiction. I want to get into that because I think that's an interesting kind of caveat in how we look at the genre. Because really the genre itself says so much about our world today and influences both our own understanding of the fields within science, as well as so many other things. And science fiction doesn't really have to do all the time with, robots and aliens. Sometimes it has to do with the social science aspects of robots and aliens. There are whole things like the future histories, like Heinlein would do, or the decades worth of exposition as far as Star Trek's future history. 2063, that's the first contact, and then from there things progressively evolve. There's a lot of detail because there's a lot of, one-liners about the Earth's history. Folks are expositing that all the time. So those things develop with future history. You have things like, what is the social impact? What is the sociology of having robots? Like, what does that say about our current situation? What does that say about where we are? And how do other people get along with that? What does that say about the human condition? What do aliens say about the human condition? What does that finding that mean about our place in the cosmos? And how do we all react? So those other areas within science fiction are also things that can be analyzed, because social science fiction is a thing. Social science is one of my great loves, as well as science fiction. So it becomes inevitable, right? You got to see those things together. And so that's also an aspect of when we look at these great themes of the 20th century, that the idea of this scientific exploration of man, the idea of progress, the ideal of meliorism, the way that we're headed forward and trying to better the human condition. And sometimes that lands us in states of tyranny, and that is why we've seen such a development of dystopia. We see also post-apocalypticism with the development of that genre. We've seen just fears about nuclear war, which were just populated the last century, through the middle of the last century. But this is not the only place I want to go with this podcast. I'm going to be doing things as far as things progress. I'd like to talk, a few ideas, Westerns and ethics. A man with a gun as the central player in a Western, by necessity, talks a great deal about matters of ethics, fantasy and axiology. What matters? And are we chosen for specific purposes? What's the place of tradition? What are the roles in society? Who gets to name those? Monarchs just have this crown. Is it their divine right? Where do these people come from? Why are they here? And what is the philosophy of our meaning? And what does it say about that? The ideas of horror and justice. Do people get what they deserve? We're going to talk about the idea of detective fiction and epistemology, like I mentioned before. We're going to talk about the ways in which those things impact our view of the world. We'll talk about things like metafiction, of course. We'll talk about alternate history and the kind of philosophy of history. We'll talk about just a variety of different subjects that pertain to fiction and the ideas that are in there, because it really is. I know that there's kind of this divide between literary fiction and genre fiction, and genre fiction is considered, kind of pop fiction, if you will. It's like, this is the pop. This is to pop music what Bob Dylan is to pop music, I guess you could say, or perhaps maybe snobbish views of classical music. As much as I love my classical music, it may be considered more sophisticated than pop, but in different ways treated, can be viewed through a similar lens, an analysis, a way of appreciating the topic and looking at these ideas. Because I don't think most people really see the difference between those areas, because of the fact that there's just so many ideas living within the world of genre fiction. We talk about ideas as something that exists purely for the purpose. I have an idea. It's like, anything and everything can be an idea, but what is an idea in itself? It's something that interacts with other ideas, for sure. And that's, you're using the term itself in the definition, and that's a no-go. That's a breaking of a rule there. But the idea and the premise exists of the idea, of the simple matter of what an idea is, that at its core, it's a thought unto itself, with really able to be boiled down and stated. And obviously those are crafted by other things around it. Like robots are an idea, but robots as citizens is another idea. Those things can be inflected and expounded upon, and those things are at the core of what genre fiction is. But the idea of religion and science fiction as an introduction to this season, it's an interesting intersection. Both religion and science deal with the subject of knowledge at its base, which is really what science fiction is also getting at. Kind of that idea of it's really a prognostication, a projection, kind of a look at the future. And not all science fiction happens in the future. It could be now, but it's basically a widening of the possibilities that exist based on what we currently know or what we're currently dealing with in the world. Things like environmental fiction kind of deal with what happens to the world based on what humans are doing in it. So that would be a matter of expanding on it. It might not take place in the far future. It could be happening now, even. Things like time travel fiction often will have an inventor in the future. It's like, I'm the first time traveler. And that will be a gateway into visiting all these different places, all these different locations, and kind of suggesting that. So it builds upon what we could perceive, what we could conceive in the world today. And that's really the I guess you could say, the arch conceit of what science fiction is. It's something happening in the world with drawing from ideas and views about where things are as they stand. Unlike fantasy, which really systematically alters components in the real world, kind of inventing things in and of themselves, sci-fi examines the hypotheticals, which are, at least in some degree, grounded in a potential truth. That tends to be different between their two views about the world, about their own worlds. What's interesting, though, is it's still sci-fi. Is it still sci-fi after it's disproven? That's kind of a good question. We don't get many stories in the style of Jules Verne and Wells these days that can in good faith be really called sci-fi. Most stories written today about, cannon shooting men at the moon, those would be fantasy. So does it come down to the knowledge of the times? It is also true of anything featuring, a geocentric model of the solar system. If we look back at Johann Kepler's short story Somnium. Well, actually, was it a story? Or rather, it might have been a book. Excuse my lack of knowledge at the moment. But anyway, we have that story, which features, things like mentions of witches and daemons, which I believe, he would have been perceiving as mostly a particular spirit that, not necessarily nefarious, but as that, within the classical world, the daemon was something different, kind of similar to the genius or the genius, if you will, from... is a Latin term. But yeah, those kind of spirits that interacted, seeing definitions of lesser deity and such as being a helpful kind of look at it. Kepler has a story about basically, visiting the moon. The idea of basically having been transported there. Those elements, within the common circuit of the time, are those still sci-fi? Well... that's a good question, and I think it comes down to an epistemological view of what we could know, what we have known, and really what can we know at the end of the day. In what ways can we say that this, as far as intention goes, is going to be science fiction? I know we kind of put that label on there because, well, I don't think that Kepler knew he was writing what we would call sci-fi today, but the point being is that he did write it, and it's been called that, and Voltaire and the like have even been said to write sci-fi, and those exist as a pre-formation of sci-fi as it came to be known. Something like Frankenstein, which is considered a grandparent to modern sci-fi, really it gets off with relative ease, fortunately for it, because it doesn't explain what Victor Frankenstein's sacred, most dear secret is, in that it doesn't tell us how he creates this monster, how it brings it to life. And, I don't know. That could be a cop-out. Perhaps you could accuse Mary Shelley of, well, I don't know the science here. Although she was inspired by galvanism, so there was science there, for sure. Which is why Frankenstein is generally depicted as being brought to life by lightning. But the point being is that this story has survived because of the fact it is really pertains to our own ideas of science fiction and plausibility. The reanimation of things and the ability to bring things to life, something like this cobbled together body that Frankenstein has made. It provides us an interesting perception of the possibilities at play and what man can do, and also where man can go wrong in his would-be apotheosis. But yeah, we'll talk more about that down the line as well. But yeah, so what really is sci-fi whenever you get after the fact? Time travel is not provable, is it? We have the idea of things traveling forward in time. The current opinion is that sci-fi back in time isn't possible. Or, well, rather, time travel back in time isn't possible. Only traveling forward in space, or any difference in relativity to the Earth, which is really our how time for us stays consistent. And so because of the lack of both forward and backward mobility, I don't think you could call this true time travel. I would say, based on the criteria, that both directions typically and as a standard are accessible. I saw Tenet, for instance, which does have a complete system of backward and forward moving in time. It's plausible in its world. But is it sci-fi if it's not really in ours? Well, that's something to consider, and it's interesting when time travel exists in something like a fantasy genre, where it doesn't really have to explain itself or, ask you to convince them. It's present in works like the German Rubenrow, and arguably what seems to be an Americanized counterpart called Timebound. They're both novels. Usually there's an inborn time travel ability that lets these individuals go across time. It's an intriguing idea, and one I'd really like to see more of, honestly. But is it a true expression of the time travel subgenre because of the fact it doesn't need an explanation. It just needs world building. So it does need explanation in the sense that it needs a reason for why it exists in this particular period. It just doesn't need science, if you will. And so that's really the interesting thing to consider in terms of time travel. Will it be disproven? And if so, can we still use it in science fiction? Can we still have this machine? And can we explain it away by making it a TARDIS that's so advanced and really so full of details and understanding that we can't even come to perceive it in its like for all that it really is, and so many different convoluted aspects? Well, that's a story for another time. But I think that we can safely say that these ideas and these building blocks are something to be taken seriously, because they, in so many ways, they form our culture, for one, and they influence how we perceive the future. But outside of that, genre in general, in ways we tell stories, in ways that we expect things to be played out, in the ways that we find entertainment and learn more about ourselves and others. I bring this conversation to you all today for that specific purpose, for the purpose of talking about these ideas and kind of getting further along in discussing where it's all headed, what it all means. If we want to go into the big questions today. And so that's the purpose overall, that we need more understanding about these things, and that they are taken seriously, as there have been quite a few books written specifically about this season's topic of religion and science fiction. That's certainly something that's been addressed at some length. And we see that across the board, and we see that developing over time as things go forward. So, hey, I want to remind everybody that this is part of the Arrow Podcast Network, and we are very happy to have you listening here. Also want to remind you that you can follow me on Twitter at Clayton J. Hester, and I'll be tweeting about a number of things, but this podcast is definitely going to be one of them. I'm going to be having all sorts of different and interesting aspects covered within this podcast itself, and more details to come about where we're headed, about what we're going to cover, and just the interesting facets that exist within the realm of science fiction. You can also follow me on Medium, where I'll be writing throughout the season. I'll also be adding to the development of Conceit over there. Conceit is going to be a multi-armed effort, multi-armed entity unto itself, about covering these ideas and the purpose and meaning behind them. The ideas, the tropes, the premises, it's all in the bag and all in the box. And so until next time, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'm Clayton Hester.